Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to do something a little bit different. Recently I have seen a lot of my fellow booktubers doing a video tier ranking all of the books they read in 2024. I thought those were great videos. I really liked the idea, but because I wanted to do it a little bit differently, what we're going to go ahead and do here today in this video is I'm going to go through everything I read in 2024. Everything will be in my ranked order. So if you look at all of the books I have down here, this is my actual ranking. So this is first. Once we get down here to the nonfiction and comics, that is the end of the ranking. But everything else is in order of what I thought going, ending the year. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go through if I would recommend them or if I would not recommend them to what I'm going to consider the average person. Now, obviously, I could find a way to recommend every single one of the books I read last year to somebody. Everybody has specific tastes. All books are different. There's a book for every single person, and every book has a specific reader that it's going for. This is supposed to be fun. I'm sure, we could really get into the weeds for it, but I'm going to do my best to give you my ranking, a quick little thoughts about the book, and then whether or not I would recommend it to, like I said, an average person coming up to me that I really don't know too much about, because I think that's what really makes it fun. Obviously, once again, could recommend everything to somebody, but that's not the point of today's video. So let's get right into it. Like I said, this is my actual ranked order. So if you are curious about that, you can see everything here. And we're going to go ahead and start off first with Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This was one of two 5-star books rankings that I gave out. And this is an easy, I would recommend this to like the average person who came up to me and started asking me about books. I think this is a very profoundly impactful book. I do know that for some people, Pet Sematary can maybe be a little bit long, that there's going to be some strange elements in it at the end. But I think the themes of grief and sacrifice and like what you would do for your family, and there's just a lot of other little things that are woven into this book are just so highly impactful that I have a hard time believing it's something I shouldn't recommend to a lot of people. I'm not saying everybody will like these books that I'm going to say I'm going to recommend, but for me, this is an easy recommend book. If somebody came up to me and was like, hey, I want a book that I think that you think I should read, I think this is an easy one for me to recommend to quite a few people. Now, next up is an author who definitely has a lot of controversy around him recently, and that is something that I don't think should be totally overlooked, but that would be Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, my number 2 book, and the only other 5-star I gave out in 2024. And this is actually a very easy would not recommend. So even though I personally love this book, I think this is one of those books that just won't work for most people. I think it has a kind of a strange story structure. I think it has a little bit of a different vibe, and I think it's maybe just not something that I would recommend to most people. There are some very like horrific things that happen in here, and honestly, it probably comes more to a stylistic thing than anything that I think a lot of people just aren't going to click with. If the average person came up to me, this is not one of the first books that I would be grasping for to recommend to everybody. And now we are getting into the 4-star books. So next up is another Stephen King book, and that would be Misery. And this is one I kind of am going to go back and forth on because I could see a world in where I do recommend this to people. But I think for the most part, this is going to be a do not recommend, mostly because there are some very like horrific body horror things that happen in this book that I just think for a lot of people are going to be extremely off-putting. It's going to be a struggle to read it. And I think some of the stuff that happens in here is like hard to read. And so it's hard for me to be like, hey, you should read this book that has a lot of like basically torture in it, right? A very tortured character. And for me, that is a hard thing to recommend to like the average person. Obviously, somebody could convince me otherwise, but for right now, I'm going to have that in a would not recommend category. Next up, my favorite fantasy book from 2024, The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee. This is a grimdark epic fantasy story. I'm actually currently in the middle of the second book, The Blackest Heart, right now. And I think if the average person came up to me and said they want a fantasy book to read, man, this is actually a really hard one because I think, once again, those darker elements, unless I know more about the person, it's not something that I would normally recommend. So this is going to be one of the ones where I'm going to assume that the person at least tells me they are okay with grimdark, and I'm going to go ahead and recommend it. I think this is a great story for somebody who is getting back into fantasy but likes those darker elements because it has a lot of the tropes that you are going to know and appreciate from other stories. But I think they're done decently well and also add some interesting twists to the world here in the Isle. What is it? The Five Isles? Is that the name of the world here? not important. Like I said, I think if I know just that one little disclaimer, this is a book I'm pretty comfortable recommending. And next up, we're going to kind of do for a 2-for-1 here, because we have Empire of the Dam and Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff. These are the first 2 books in that series. And this is another one where I think it is hard to recommend. I think in the same vein, if somebody tells me they are okay with more grimdark elements, I'm going to put them in the wood category. Now, I will say, I think 50 pages into Empire of the Vampire, you're going to know if this is a book you would want to read. But in general, I think as long as I know that one little disclaimer that you are okay with some more adult elements, some more darker themes in your book, those are some books, fantasy books, that I would recommend to the average person, because I do think they are pretty consumable, right? I don't think and this is kind of bring me to the next book, The War Host of Vastmark by Jenny Wirtz. This is a series that I probably would already put into my top 10, having only read 3 of the 11 books, right? But this is not for the average person. I don't think. Do I think anybody could read it? Yes, of course. But I think more people are going to be more comfortable reading the prose of a Empire of the Vampire, Empire of the Damned, The Forgetting Moon, than they are with Jenny Wirtz. Now, if somebody comes to me and tells me that they have read more advanced things, and I'm only saying that because I think this book is going to be more challenging than most people, the average person who's getting back into reading, is going to want to put into a book. I think, you kind of want to reward somebody with something kind of nice and easy, and I think this is much more of an intermediate book once you've kind of gotten your feet wet and you know what you like. Next up, we have another Stephen King book with Kujo, and this is actually going to be a pretty easy not recommend for me. I think a lot of this book is kind of on the boring side. I think you spend a lot of time doing things with characters that really aren't all that important to the overall story that happens here. It's another one of King's stories that really kind of takes place in a small town. You get to know a lot about the goings on of the town, the people of the town, but I can totally see so many people not liking this. It's not one that comes to mind. I have Pet Sematary up here if we're going to point somebody to the Stephen King train. Unfortunately for me, Kujo is not going to be one of the first ones I recommend, mostly because I think a lot of people are just going to find it extremely boring, which is a funny thing because I had a great time sitting in the town and just getting to know everybody and seeing what happens, and just it's a very high rated book for me, so it's easy for me to like, but not necessarily one I'm going to be pointing to as a hard recommend for everybody else. Next up, we have another interesting book. This is A Time of Changes by Robert Silverberg, and unfortunately this is another one that I have to go in and say I do not recommend this. This is an older sci-fi book, and once again, this is a book that I think really goes over some very interesting themes, particularly of the South versus like the collective, and there's some really cool stuff that goes on in here, but there's also just some really weird, trippy elements to this book that I think for today's average reader, it's not going to be for, and this is one I have gone back and forth on, because I do think that this is one that I would give to challenge somebody, but it's not going to be for the average random person I see. Now, we get to Return to Edan by Philip Chase, and I would definitely put this one, and this is really going to speak for the series as a whole. Obviously, this is the third book in a trilogy, but the way this series goes, I once again think it, like The Forgetting Moon, has some of those very familiar beginning fantasy tropes, but absolutely twists a lot of them and does a lot of interesting things, ends up asking a decent amount of the reader to like kind of do some self reflection. I think it has an interesting cast of characters who you're going to love and hate, and there's going to just be a lot that goes on here. So the series as a whole, yes, Return to Edan was my favorite of the 3 books, so an easy recommend. Once again, this book alone makes the trilogy worth reading. I think that's how good I think this book is in particular. And now we have Wind and Truth. This is, I would say, kind of a controversial book here on BookTube currently. There are some very big detractors, and there are also people who still really liked it. So this, like Return to Edan, because this is the last book in kind of a series, I'm going to say I would still recommend the Stormlight Archive to like the average fantasy fan. I know a lot of people think that like it's not the best place to start, but I know plenty of people who this is where they started their Sanderson journey, and they had a great time with the series, and they haven't read anything else outside of the Cosmere. So if you are like sitting at Rhythm of War and you're seeing some of the stuff getting talked about, I think you owe yourself to read this book. And I know there's going to be a lot of people who have read this and disagree with me now because they have been so disappointed by it, but I think there is enough interesting things that happen here, and worst case, this is the end of the first arc, right? If you don't like it after this, you can really stop. And I think this is a better spot to get closure from than Rhythm of War. So if you get to here, I think so. and Not Till We Are Lost. So this is a series that I'm still going to put into the would recommend for right now, but I will say with the caveat that if the next book doesn't deliver on a little bit more than the current one, it might slip into a would not recommend, because I think the first 3 books of this series are so amazing. And I will say Ray Porter being the narrator for the audiobooks really does help. I think there are a lot of interesting sci-fi concepts here. The idea of this is somebody's brain is put into a computer that then can self-replicate in space. And to me, the concept alone is amazing. Not Till We Are Lost was still a good time, but I don't think it reaches the heights of some of the earlier books. But it's still going to get the would recommend. And specifically, obviously, you would have to start with the first book if I didn't know anything about you. But it's still an easy recommend. Now we have All the Fiends of Hell by Adam Neville. This is, again, a pretty easy would recommend. I think it's almost zombies done differently, but it's not zombies, it's aliens, right? But I multiple times when reading this book, I felt like this was a zombie kind of story. I think it does post-apocalyptic stuff really well. I will say, if you're somebody who needs answers, I probably would move it, but I think in general, it's a fun is not the right word. It is a compelling read that is interesting enough that I think I would recommend it. Obviously, it was pretty high up in my rankings, so I would say yes. So next up, we have The Night by Will White. This is the 3rd book in his Last Horizon series, and I will once again put that in would, mostly because I think this is just a very fun, light series. Think of something that like people would consider a palate cleanser. I think this series is great for that. There's enough world building going on. There's enough interesting character stuff, but this is like also sci-fantasy to the max. Like the first book cover is literally a wizard holding a space laser and a wand, so like it has some of those fun silly elements, but also has some of those serious in-depth things that I think the average person would enjoy for the most part. Now we are back to my man Stephen King with The Shining, and I'm going to actually put The Shining in I would not recommend. Overall, The Shining is a book that since I have finished it, I have thought more and more about, and I would probably move up this ranking a little bit, but it is still not necessarily a book that I would recommend to a lot of people. This is once again a slow descent into madness kind of book where nothing's really happening that quickly. I think there are some maybe like dream-esque sequences that a lot of people won't like. I think the ending is going to be very divisive amongst people who have read it and whether or not they like it. And so for me, if we're going to talk about King, I'm not going to point people here as like the best thing to start. Next up, we have The Mountain Crown by Karen Lewoshi. This is another interesting one. This is one that I think does a really interesting job of looking at what would happen if a group of people leave land that is being conquered because they don't want to be part of a conflict, but they have like traditions that they need to uphold with that land now being conquered by a different group of people. And I think it's really well done. I think it's beautifully written. And for me, another thing that makes this an easy would recommend is it is extremely short. I think the audiobook is like 3 hours or something. And I have a lot of easier time recommending something that is really short to somebody who I think they're looking for something, and because it's an easy read, it's quick satisfaction, and so that is another easy one to recommend. And funny enough, we are back to Stephen King, and once again, for me, this is not, and so many people love these books, right? I feel like I'm saying I wouldn't recommend these to the average person, even though so many people read these and love these. But to me, Salem's Lot, while it is a good book, I think it has a lot of flaws that are going to irritate a lot of people. They irritated me in some instances. Once again, it has that same, we're just hanging out in town. We're just getting to know. We know that lady. We learned so much about this lady who just calls everybody and gets everybody's business, and she's just gossiping. I also will say, to me, the end of this book, stuff happens that just feels preposterous in a way, in a horror book that involves supernatural elements. It just feels so outlandish that it was hard for me to suspend my disbelief sometimes, which is a really interesting thing to say, right? I mean, it's a horror book, like I said, and so I don't know. It's a book that I, like I said, still ended up enjoying a decent amount, but it is not necessarily one that I'm grasping at to, recommend to everybody. Now, next up, we have Letters from an Unknown Woman. This is also going to be an easy recommend. Once again, this is an extremely short book. I think this is like 40 pages long or something like that. So it takes no time at all to read. But this is not the descent into madness, but this is a story of obsession, which you could maybe qualify as madness as well. But this is the story of a woman who is obsessed with this man and just everything she has done in her life. It's a letter to her from her to him, and it's recanting all of the tales and all of the things she has done, thrown her life away because she's so obsessed with this guy. And it sounds crazy and cringy, but it is very well written, and it's an engrossing story that, like, I binged it super quick. Obviously, like I said, very short, but it is definitely something that I just thought was super well done. And really enjoyed. So next up is The Cretaceous Past. This is a book from my favorite author, and it basically, the idea here is that the idea that humans are the only intelligent species that have been on Earth is just not correct. And so it goes back in time to the Cretaceous period, where there are dinosaurs and ants, and basically they build up, become intelligent, and I mean, at the end, by the end of this story, they are a highly advanced civilization. And there's some really interesting things going on here with that idea, but this is, once again, not the kind of book that I would recommend to the average person who came up to me and wanted them to, like, for me to pick a book out for them. I think this is such an ideas book. Like, I don't remember there even being character names here in this book. So it's not, something that I think I could recommend to a lot of people. Next up is The Master of Whitestorm by Jenny Wirtz. Now, I do think this is a Jenny Wirtz book that I could recommend to the average person coming up to me, mostly because I think it is a fun sword and sorcery book that ends up being so much deeper than that. And her other standalone, To Ride Hell's Chasm, which I have not read yet. I have a copy of it sitting on my shelf. I just haven't gotten to it yet. That one gets recommended a lot, and I'm sure for good reason, but I think this is such like a fun classic fantasy kind of story that I wish more people would give this one a chance as well. So we have a twofer again here with Memories of Ice and Gardens of the Moon, and I don't know if this is going to be a surprising thing, but these are definitely not books that I would off the bat recommend to somebody I didn't know. I feel like they ask a lot of the reader. I do think that the complexity of these books has been overblown. I don't think they are as complicated and terrifying as to read as some people say they are, but I don't think they are a great place for the average person to start reading a fantasy book. I feel like they would feel even more lost than you're supposed to when you get into these books. So they're an easy would not recommend for, like I said, the average person. If you are a fantasy fan who has read enough fantasy, obviously yes, I think it is a series I would recommend to you, but starting here as not as a random person, I would say no. Then we have Neon Ghost by booktuber Daniel Green. I guess you could, I should say author now because he's published a few books. And for me, this is absolutely a pretty easy recommend. I think the main character here is an interesting but also frustrating character, which sometimes I like. I like when a character isn't always just like a super lovable, likable person. There's so much going on in this story. Personally, I'm a giant fan of mega structures. And so the fact that the setting of this is like a mega city with like different levels and every floor has like different things going on, and like it's also like a hierarchy of class and everything. I don't know. It just works super, super well for me. A book that worked really well for me, but not for a lot of other people, is The Mercy of Gods by James S.A. Corey. And while it worked for me and not for a lot of other people, I am going to put it in the would not recommend category, and that is mostly because I think the characters in here are pretty not like they're not great, right? I know a lot of people read this after reading The Expanse and were extremely disappointed. I understand why people are. They wanted more of The Expanse, and this is very much not The Expanse. The Expanse, if The Expanse was on this list, that's an easy recommend for many people. The Mercy of the Gods, I think, is much more of a high concept idea kind of book, and so I would not just like overtly recommend this to the average person. Next up, we have another book by my favorite author, and that is Supernova Era. And once again, this is a very easy would not recommend. This is once again an idea book, and I think in general these kind of books are not something that I would ever recommend to just like a random person I don't know anything about. Supernova Era basically is the idea that a supernova has hit Earth, and the radiation from that has basically altered everybody's genes above the age of, I believe, is it 10 or 12? And basically it's radiated them enough that their cells are not going to be able to recover and they're going to die. But that also means everybody the age of 12 and under is going to live. And so the first part of this book is adults basically trying to train children to take over the world. Like, there are operations that are obviously going to have to continue for society to continue and thrive, even though they are children. And that's the basic premise. But then a lot of stuff happens here. Once again, this is the kind of story where I can't remember if they even really use character names. There are definitely multiple times where children are referred to as the country they're from. There are character names, but they're just so unimportant that I don't think it really matters. And so while I do think it's a very interesting novel, it's something I really liked, and I think the idea is interesting, it's not something I'm going to recommend to the average person. Next up, we have Greenwood. This was recommended to me by a friend of mine. he loved it, and I know a bunch of other people who really loved it. This is really a story of familial trauma through the generations, and I think there is a really great book hidden in here. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff in here that I didn't like, and I don't want this to just be like I liked / didn't like a book for what I recommended or not, but I think for me this is not something I would easily recommend to like the average person, mostly because I think a lot of the POVs we get in here are quite frustrating, and I just didn't like them, and I know that is actually part of the beauty that my friends liked, and so I understand that while it was for them, it wasn't for me, so it's not something I'm going to jump out and recommend. Unlike Fury of the Gods, so this is the third book in the Bloodsworn trilogy, and I liked the first book, really liked the second book, and then I liked the third book again. I think this is a pretty easy, would recommend the average person who said they want to read a fantasy book once again, just because I think it's fun. I think if you binge these, I think the series would be significantly better. That is something that I just feel like these are super bingeable books, and I would highly recommend. Obviously, third book in the series, big epic battle, John Gwynne doing the stuff John Gwynne does. I know other people who were much more disappointed in this than I was, but it was still a book that I liked, So we'll go ahead and jump into the next one, which is Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. And this was a book that went from the potential of being a 5-star book to all the way down to, I think it was a 3-star, maybe even a 2-star. It was, like I said, the early part of this book is so good. Basically, the idea is the Titanic in space, right? You have a group of people deep in outer space doing a job, and they get a distress signal from a ship that has been lost for ages. And there are some like similarities to the Titanic of like the disappearance and the mystery around the ship and everything. And there's this awesome tension of like, is it ghost related? Is it just weird coincidences, all this stuff? And I think the resolution that we get in the latter part of the book just kills so much of this story for me. While I did have a good time with it overall, I think it really flounders in that second half for sure. Next up, we have The Willows, and this is a short horror story, and if you have spent any time in the woods, I think this is a must read just in general, but this is something that I would easily recommend to the average person who's looking for something that's just a little spooky. One, again, it is very short, which I'm always very open to recommending, but I think it also just has that creeping, building tension of like, you get spooked when you're out somewhere, and then things keep happening, they keep building it up, and you're just worried, and that pressure that you feel when you feel like something is happening to you. And yeah, so The Willows was a really good time. Next up is The Phoenix Keeper. This was my first attempt at reading a romantasy. I think this being marketed as a romantasy is slightly disingenuous. I would recommend, I would market this more as like a cozy fantasy. And as far as that goes, I think it's fine. I don't think this is something that I would jump to recommend. I did enjoy my time. If there was a second one of these, I would read it, I guess, if that says anything. But I think there are just some, like, the stakes are so low that it's hard for me to care too much about so much that happened in here. And yeah, it's not just something that I would recommend to somebody. The Gallant. Now, I'm going to kind of be talking out of both sides of my mouth here, because I talked about how I probably would not recommend The Wars of Light and Shadow to the average person. However, I do think I would recommend The Gallant, because I think it's more consumable, right? It's a short story, so I think that helped. This is such a heartbreaking tale. Is really, it's an emotionally hitting book, and it's just something that I think I would recommend to somebody. If somebody was like, should I read this? Yeah, I think you should. Unlike, it's harder for me to recommend such a long series with Wars of Light and Shadow to the average person, but this one little bite-sized piece of her writing, a little bit of that story, this is like a prelude to it. I think this is much more consumable. Next up is John Scalzi, and Red Shirts is a book that the more I think about it, I think the lower down it goes in my estimation. I think there is a fun concept that goes on in here, but I just don't think it's my favorite kind of thing. I think Scalzi is kind of one of those authors that is so individually based that there are going to be so many people who really enjoy his writing, and then there are going to be people who detest it so much. There's another book by him that I read. It's the one with the cat on it. I think it's Starter Villain, and like I quite enjoyed that one, and then so I wanted to read some of his other stuff, and I think this is probably his best known book. And man, it was such a letdown after that. So he is a polarizing author, so he's not probably one I would recommend right away. Now we have Sunbringer. So Sunbringer is book 2 in the Fallen Gods trilogy, I believe is what it's called. The first one is called God Killer, and this is a fantasy series that I would recommend. Now, it is not like the most serious fantasy, but it is one that I think is a very unique world, and I think that in of itself is worth reading. This is the world where everything has a god. Like literally buttons have a a god in this world, and gods of like bigger, more important things have more power associated with them compared to like smaller ones and everything. But we follow a god killer whose job it is to kill gods, and we kind of go on an adventurer's tale starting from there. And there's some twists and turns, some political intrigue and everything. This book in particular I was a little let down on, but the series as a whole, I still think it is a pretty easy recommend. Okay, and then next up we have Dead House Gates by Steven Erikson. I kind of already said my piece about this with Memories of Ice and Gardens of the Moon. Dead House Gates is just not, the series is just very hard to recommend to a lot of people. Now we have Jerusalem Fire. This is going to be another one that is not something I would recommend to the average person. I think there are some really cool concepts that go on in here, but in general, I've honestly forgotten a lot of the details, which happens sometimes, right? You can't remember every single detail about every single book, but I remember there being a somewhat interesting concept with the main character, and you know, it has to do with like the military and that kind of stuff. So once again, it's an older sci-fi book, so there's some of that writing that I don't think would click with a lot of people. Next, we have Impact Winter. This is specifically season 3, and this is going to be something that I still recommend to people. Season 2 was a huge letdown for me. Season 3 was a step back up, and I think season 1 is amazing. I hesitate to even really call this a book. This is much more of an audible presentation, showcase, whatever you want to call it, but it is something that I would recommend. I think this shows a similar world to Empire of the Vampire, where vampires have taken over, right? There has been a calamity that has blocked out the sun, and vampires are running amok. There's different hierarchies of vampires, which I think there is interesting, and the story kind of goes from there. I don't want to give away too much, but I do think it is something I would recommend. And if you are an Audible person, I believe these are all included in your Audible memberships, which is always really nice. I always enjoy getting those extra perks. So now we have Tau Zero by Paul Anderson, and this is going to be another one of those sci-fi things where it's just like a big idea. Wouldn't recommend. Did I think it was interesting? Yes, personally, but that is not, I think, going to be the case for a lot of people. Next up, we have The Last Question by Isaac Asimov. I do think this is something I would recommend to people, once again, because it is so short, and it's kind of a cyclical tale, right? It's trying to figure out the last question of the universe, right? Like, what is going to happen? And I think it's just, it's interestingly written. This is the only thing I've read by Asimov, so that, you know, I would like to read more from him. But in general, because really, if this was much longer than it is, I don't think I would recommend it, because it is such an idea thing. But I think because it's such a bite-sized piece of an idea, it works out all right. And then we have, what is this? Stories of your life, stories for your life. Really, this is the story of Arrival, if you've seen the movie with Amy Adams. And this is, yes, something I would recommend. I think the movie is better, but once again, this is a short story that I think has an interesting enough concept, and it's different enough from the movie that I think it is worth reading. Next up, we have The Deal of a Lifetime by Frederick Bachman. I would say yes, I would recommend this one. It isn't Bachman's best work, I will say that. He has some really high highs and everything, but this is an okay. Once again, this is really one that I would say, yeah, I would recommend because it's short. You know, I don't even think it's that amazing, but as a showcase of Bachman's writing, I would alone for that say yes. Next, we have George R.R. Martin's The Ice Dragon. This is a fun story. There's some prelude stuff to the world of Ice and Fire, even though this is technically not a part of it. There's some really tricky marketing that goes on with this book where the publisher tries to make it seem like it is, but I've seen where George says it's not. So unless he changed his mind recently, this is actually not a part of the world, but you can see some of the tendrils, and you could see how this would totally be like a story that somebody in A Song of Ice and Fire would tell to somebody, like an old man story. I could totally imagine her telling the story to Bran at some point, right? So it's Martin. It's just a good time. It's like just a short, fun fantasy story that's very whimsical. It is very fairy tale-esque. Next up, we have The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton, I believe. And I'm going to say this is not one I would recommend to a lot of people, because I think, like me, I liked it, don't get me wrong, but I think a lot of people will find it quite frustrating. I think the last third or so of this book, there's so many characters and none of them are identifiable enough for me that I kind of struggled remembering who's who and like what things we've got going on here. So I would put it in no for now. Next up, we have Liv Suits, which is a novella based in the Mercy of the Gods universe. So I'm going to put that in I would not recommend, but I would actually recommend this more than the Mercy of the Gods. This is a whole different element to this story, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay, and then next up we have Murder on the North Pole Express. This is an easy recommend for me. I think Patricia Meredith writes some really fun like Christmas stories. Now, this isn't something I would say to go read on July 4th, right? But in December, yeah, I would say go ahead, read this. Go read Death of a Christmas Tree Salesman. They're fun, cozy murder mystery kind of stories following Sam Shovel, a snowman that comes back to life. And I just think it is a great time. It's nothing serious, but it is fun to read in the Christmas season. Next up, we have The Employees, and this is a rather strange read. I didn't really enjoy my time with it. I think it asks a lot of the reader to like think about some like weird things that are going on. This is one of those books where I just am fully confident in saying I didn't really understand what the point of the story that's going on, and it's probably one that I should go ahead and like do some like cursory research on and just figure out like what was I missing. There's this whole thing of like a human crew and basically like an android crew, and like what is human, what is not human, which sometimes to me is just like a scientific idea that doesn't really click with me, and we'll have some of those later as well. Next up is The Deep by Nick Cutter. This is not one that I would recommend as well. This was a book that started off really great. I will say the atmosphere of this book is so well done. Nick Cutter makes you feel so claustrophobic. This takes place at the bottom of the Mariana Trench in Challenger Deep, and I will say it felt claustrophobic. It felt horrifying and dark and cramped and all of those kinds of things. Like that tension was there, but I think the rest of the story really suffers from what's going on. And yeah, I just was not my favorite thing. Next up, we have The Book of Elsewhere by China Mieville / Keanu Reeves. And this isn't very so easy, would not recommend this book. I had a miserable time with it. I think maybe if I had read the comics and then read this, maybe I'd be more connected to it. But this is such a meandering tale that I don't think anything interesting happens in. All of the interesting stuff is like, this interesting thing happened before, and let's not talk about it at all. So that was very frustrating. Gunmetal Gods. So this is a book that I had a more difficult time with, I think, than a lot of other people, but this is one I would recommend specifically because this is a fantasy book that is very outside of the traditional, what I will say, medieval UK kind of culture. So like, knights in shining armor, that kind of thing. This is very much, I believe it is like Indian inspired or more that kind of culture, Middle Eastern. I don't remember exactly which culture it's pulling some of these things from, but it is definitely one that I would recommend for that alone. I think the world is very interesting, and there is some really cool magic that goes on here and everything. So yeah, definitely one that I would recommend, even though it didn't really work for me. Up is The Answer Is No by Frederick Bachman. This is The Answer Is No. I would not recommend it. There is one little snippet in here that really I think highlights how great of a writer Frederick Bachman is, but I think in general this is just mostly a pretty frustrating story, right? Next up is Blindsight by Peter Watts. So I did not like this book. This is a book that did not work for me, but I know so many people rave about this book, and so I am going to go put it here, even though I think it's really weird, and this is probably as big of a reach as I would put in for a book that I read last year that I would recommend. This is, it's interesting. It's sold as First Contact, but to me, the real scientific idea is the idea of consciousness and what is thought, and there's other stuff that goes on in there, but for me, it's just did not click for me, but it is one that I would recommend. The Salt Grows Heavy is also going to not be one that I would recommend. This is a very strange story with some very graphic things that happen in it that I would just not recommend for the average person. Roadside Picnic. This is one of my least favorite books I have ever read. And I think I'm in the minority on that because I know a lot of people really kind of like the idea of humanity being visited by an alien race that they thought we were so insignificant that they stopped and left before we could even try to communicate with them. And there's all kinds of weird things that happen in it, but it is just, I don't know if it was the characters that put me off from it, there's just so much about it that just did not work for me. So those are all of the novels I read before we get into the nonfiction and comic section of this. So I think that's actually a pretty even split. Even though there are so many of these that I liked, there are definitely plenty of them that I would not recommend, including my second favorite book of the year, which I think is a pretty interesting thing. So next up, to go into the nonfiction before we get to the comics quickly. This is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. This is the first of his 3 autobiographies, and this is an easy recommend. This is one of those books that I would recommend to literally anybody. I think everybody should read it. It shows his escape from slavery, his conditions in slavery, and then, you know, just all kinds of things that happened with that in his life. And I think it's just a harrowing tale that just shows the perseverance of somebody who went through such, you know, horrific things. Next up, I read this book. This is Lessons in Stoicism. So this is, I got interested in Stoicism not because I actually like believe in any of the practices or anything like that, but because it's one of those things that so many people talk about and they actually have no idea what like the actual teachings of Stoicism is. So I wanted to like educate myself because it's something I see online so much and so many people talk about, and I just was like, no, they don't actually know. So with the caveat of like you want to learn a little bit about it, I would say, yeah, I would recommend that. Next up are the 3 comics I read last year. The first one is called Shortcomings. This is definitely one that I would recommend. This just kind of shows like how a relationship that starts out well, people are well-meaning, and then you just kind of have that decay. If you're somebody who's been in a relationship where there's not like a catastrophic thing that breaks that relationship, or it's just that slow degrade where you like maybe grow apart, or somebody's a little jealous about things and that erodes trust and just all kinds of things. It's a very powerful story that I definitely would recommend, especially as comics go. 8 Billion Genies. I think this is a super fun, easy recommend. Basically, when the population of humanity and I will just say quickly, the art in this series is amazing. Some of the best art I have ever seen. But basically, when the human population gets to 8 billion, every single person gets a genie, which means everybody gets one wish. So you can imagine the chaos that could happen from there. And so that is the basic premise of that story. I think it's getting an adaptation. I think it's really fun, and I, once again, would highly recommend. And we're going to go 3 for 3 with the comics. Here we have Beneath the Tree Where Nobody Sees, and this is an easy yes for me. Basically, this is anthropomorphized animals, and one of them is basically a Dexter-like character, so she is a serial killer, and the story kind of goes from there. I don't want to give too much away. It's not like an overly original idea or anything like that, but I do think it is a rather fun one. But that is everything I read, so yeah, tell me what you would and wouldn't recommend from here. If you think I got anything super wrong, super right, I'd love to hear anything. And are you going to pick up any of these books now that I talked about them here? But that is all from me, and remember, read what you want, when you want.